Hello and welcome. If you've ever grumbled about sand in your shoes after a day at the beach, imagine living somewhere where sand doesn't just sneak uninvited into your footwear. It's an unavoidable, persistent, and utterly relentless presence in every moment of daily life. Today, we're digging into the gritty truth about an ancient civilization famous not just for its pyramids and pharaohs, but for a constant companion that was far less glamorous: sand. Yes, sand, as in billions of tiny, way too persistent grains of sand that was literally running the show. Think of ancient Egypt. When our minds conjure images of this magnificent civilization, we picture the Nile's lush banks, monumental stone temples, golden treasures, and probably a few camels striking a pose on desert dunes. Yet all of this majestic history unfolds with sand as a stubborn backdrop. A backdrop so stubborn, it was almost like sharing a studio apartment with a roommate who never paid rent, never did chores, and was always tracking little dusty footprints everywhere. Sand wasn't just part of the scenery, it was woven into the fabric of everyday Egyptian existence. Now, you might ask, how bad could it have been? Isn't sand just sand? No big deal, right? Well, if you've never lived with a roommate who treats the place like a merch store for glitter or confetti, you might not get the full picture. For the ancient Egyptians, sand was the original, uninvited guest that never left. It came with the territory. Sand was blowing into homes, slipping into beds, invading granaries, clogging workshops, and swirling through markets like an eternal, dusty cloud that refused to play fair. There was no vacuum cleaner to save the day, no Roomba to encircle it with electronic precision. Imagine trying to grind grain under a ceiling that's basically a sandstorm in slow motion, or attempting to paint elaborate murals while flecks of coarse powder coat your skin, your brushes, and the very walls you were trying to beautify. It also meant every time you turned around, you were basically scraping a thin layer of desert off yourself. Hygiene must have felt like a full-time job, though the Egyptians were famously resourceful. They washed frequently, sometimes with natron, a natural soda ash, which was part cleaning agent, part exfoliant. Probably the only bath ingredient, tougher than sand itself. The relentless presence of sand wasn't just an annoyance. It was a real challenge to survival and comfort. Consider the architecture. Ancient Egyptian builders weren't just stacking stones willy-nilly. Their homes and public buildings had to withstand the constant siege of sand and dust storms. Walls needed to be thick, doorways narrow, and windows often too small and high to keep the inside from turning into a gritty snow globe every afternoon. Yet, paradoxically, even their massive pyramids, these colossal feats of engineering and precision, were surrounded by and partly made from sand. The material that tried so hard to invade their lives also provided key resources. Sand shaped the very tools and technologies the Egyptians developed. The quartz-rich desert sands when combined and transformed, turned into glass, a shiny, mystical stuff that Egyptians mastered long before the rest of the world caught on. Not to mention, sand was essential in making mortar and plaster, binding together their bricks and stonework. And the beach where the Nile met the relentless desert wasn't just a no-man's land of grains. It was a thriving artery for trade, culture, and life itself. Yet, living so intimately with sand meant constantly battling its invasive tendencies. Grain stores had to be sealed carefully to prevent the creeping dust from contaminating food supplies. Streets and markets, dusty and sunbaked, the water they sipped, and even the scrolls scribbled with hieroglyphics. Sand was the original background noise of ancient Egypt, a quiet, unyielding hum of presence that shaped lives in ways we're only beginning to fully appreciate. Beyond the practical, sand also seeped into the Egyptian psyche. The desert wasn't just hostile terrain. It was sacred space, a symbol of chaos outside the ordered life along the Nile. The very idea of mart, or cosmic balance, was reflective of human attempts to tame life's inherent unpredictability. Sand embodied that wild, chaotic force. Even the gods had desert associations. Set, the god of chaos and storms, was often linked to desert expanses, reminding Egyptians that beyond the ordered fields and fertile banks lay raw nature, untamed and filled with grit. So why dwell on sand when we usually spotlight the grandeur of temples or the glittering gold of burial masks? Because sand was the silent partner in every ancient Egyptian story. It shaped their environment, tested their resilience, offered its resources, and reminded them daily of their place in a world that was both unimaginably rich and brutally unforgiving. To grasp the essence of ancient Egyptian life, you have to learn to live with the sand in your eyes, your ears, and even between your teeth. Living with sand was more than a fact of life. It was a lesson in adaptation and endurance. It was about transforming an obstacle into opportunity. And understanding that relationship grants us a far deeper appreciation of this civilization's remarkable achievements. Far from being a mere nuisance, sand was both adversary and ally, blurring the lines between enemy and neighbor. In this duality lies the first grady step into the ancient Egyptian experience, where the desert was not just landscape, but an ever-present companion to human triumph and struggle. So grab a glass of water, but maybe not sand, and get ready. This journey won't just explore the glories of a bygone era, but the bone-deep grit that life in ancient Egypt demanded every single day. Because if you think you've got problems with your roommate, just remember, the ancient Egyptians literally lived with sand as their incessant, invisible, and uninvited cohabitant. And that's a story worth telling. Imagine waking up every single day with a constant companion, one that gets everywhere: your hair, your clothes, your food, even your eyes. Sand. Not the kind you find neatly raked at a playground or the soft powder beneath a tropical beach umbrella, but relentless, stubborn, fine-grained, cruelly omnipresent sand. Ancient Egyptians didn't just live near sand, they lived with it, inside it, and in spite of it. It was less a backdrop and more a central character in the drama of their existence. Egypt, as a land, is a tale of extremes squeezed into a narrow strip along a life-giving river. The Nile was the lifeblood, sure, but it was cradled like a precious ribbon amidst vast deserts that stretched endlessly in every direction. To the east, the shimmering sands of the eastern desert led toward the Red Sea, a forbidding expanse where temperatures could fry your brain and the horizon seemed to melt into mirages. To the west, the western desert spread like an enormous empty canvas of dunes, gravel plains, and jagged plateaus, so vast that it swallowed armies and caravans whole. It was less neighborhood and more hostile wasteland lurking just beyond the valley. The presence of this desert was not some distant annoyance. It was the invisible hand that shaped how the Egyptians lived, moved, and survived. Every village, every city had to be built with the daunting question in mind: how do we keep the sand out? Because the winds had no mercy. Sandstorms were not a rare inconvenience, but a recurring menace that can best be imagined as Mother Nature's version of a sandblaster turned up to 11. A gust of wind could whip up the smallest particles into a choking, scratching cloud that pounded at the walls and crept into every crevice. You can almost hear the ancient sighs of frustration as people scrubbed sand from their doorways and clothes, knowing it would be back by evening. This grit wasn't just a physical irritant, but a psychological one, a brutally tactile reminder of just how small and fragile humans really were. To the naked eye, Egypt might look like a verdant paradise alongside the river, but take a few steps away from the banks, and the landscape instantly transforms into a powdery hellscape. The desert was more than a mere geographical barrier. It was a living, breathing entity with moods and dangers. It offered some degree of protection, yes. Enemy armies had a hard time trekking through what was little more than an endless sandbox, but it wasn't the kind of protection that allowed for much ease of daily life. Because of this, geography dictated the layout and makeup of nearly everything. Housing was a direct response to the environment. Mudbrick was king, not just for convenience, but out of sheer necessity. Stone was expensive and difficult to quarry, and with sand constantly gnawing at any surface, a sturdy mud brick house with thick walls was the best bet. These houses weren't palatial, despite the popular imagination of gleaming pyramids and pharaohs draped in gold. For the average person, homes were humble compounds, flat-roofed, square-edged nests, designed to keep the dust and heat out. The thick mud walls acted like natural air conditioners, absorbing the sun by day and releasing heat slowly by night. But even so, inside those walls lived a constant barrage of grit. Sand at times found its way through cracks and crevices, turning simple tasks like sweeping into endlessly futile undertakings. Travel, too, was shaped by this gritty reality. The Nile was the superhighway winding through an arid wasteland, and boats weren't just convenient, they were essential. Everything heavy or bulky moved by river, because crossing the desert otherwise was a brutal gamble. Camel caravans and donkey trains plodded across the sand with painful slowness. The desert was never conquered, only endured. There's an almost comical contrast between the life-giving black soil of the Nile floodplains, the Kemet, or Black Land, as the Egyptians called it, and the Deshret, the deadly red land of the desert. This wasn't a poetic dichotomy, it was a survival line, a razor-thin borderline between fertile abundance and lethal desolation. To think of ancient Egyptians as coddled by the Nile alone misses the point. They were constantly negotiating with a landscape that held no favors. Their survival strategies morphed and evolved around the tyranny of sand. How to grow food amid dry heat and dust storms. How to store water and keep homes cool. How to protect crops from the choking sand that could undo harvests in weeks. And this wasn't just an abstract struggle. It was an intimate, gritty, daily existence. Children were raised knowing sand's ubiquity. Their play spaces were dusty courtyards, their toys often simple stones and bits of pottery. Tradespeople learned to handle tools and materials that could not bend under the abrasive assault of grit. Even the Egyptians' religion reflects this relationship. The idea of order, ma'at, and chaos, isfit, can be seen as a reflection of the orderly Nile Valley against the wildness of the surrounding deserts. In a way, living in Egypt was like having a roommate who never cleaned up, never left. You could negotiate, try to hide, even build barriers, but sand would always return. It got into every niche of daily life, stubbornly persistent, like a bad debt collector or an annoying sibling who follows you everywhere. This forced a culture of resilience and adaptation. Architecture, agriculture, travel, even their worldview was sand-shaped. So, when we imagine ancient Egypt, it's not just the golden glimmers of temples or the monumental pyramids that defined this civilization. It's the dusty feet dragging through the streets, the relentless backdrop of the desert dunes, the grainy kiss of sand on every exposed surface. It's the story of a people living side by side with the sand, less as conquerors and more as expert negotiators with an environment that never quit. The desert was both prison and protector, menace and muse. Without it, the Nile's gift would lose its rarity. Without the sand, the story of ancient Egypt would be a very different one. But with sand, they provided us with a lesson in enduring, adapting, thriving, amid the gritty challenges of life itself. Imagine living in a world where every building, every home, every temple and tomb is essentially crafted from a humble blend of mud and sand. No concrete, no bricks straight out of a factory, just earth, sticky, gritty, and stubbornly persistent earth. This was the backbone of ancient Egyptian architecture, and it all revolved around one surprisingly tenacious little invention, the mudbrick. Mudbricks might sound like something you'd make in an afternoon arts and crafts session, but in ancient Egypt, they were literally the bricks that built civilization. These weren't just some sloppy clumps of dirt slapped together and hoped for the best. No, the Egyptians mastered the art of turning the desert's relentless sand and the Nile's generous mud into a building material that held up for thousands of years. Well, most of the time. So how did they do it? The magic ingredient was the mud itself, but not just any mud. The stuff that came from the Nile's annual floods, thick with fine silt and clay. When the waters receded, a rich, muddy layer was left behind, soft and malleable. Egyptians would dig up this unique blend of soil, essentially nature's own mortar, and mix it with sand and straw. Straw? Yes, straw. Think of it as ancient Egyptian rebar, a natural reinforcement that prevented cracking and crumbling when the bricks dried under the relentless sun. The recipe was simple, but effective. They'd mix the Nile mud with sand to give it grit and strength, then add straw fibers to hold everything together. It sounds a bit like making the world's roughest cake batter, but instead of dessert, it produced sturdy blocks that formed entire cities. The wet mud was shoveled into wooden molds. Imagine rectangular cookie cutters from the Bronze Age, and left baking dry in the scorching Egyptian sun. This baking ground was no gentle process. The bricks cracked, warped, or crumbled if the mud was too wet, too dry, or the straw wasn't right. So getting the recipe just right was a daily gamble. Yet the ingenuity didn't stop with just making bricks. The Egyptians had to face the relentless enemy, sand and sun. Sand, after all, was everywhere. It seeped into cracks, eroded surfaces, and, over time, threatened to swallow whole buildings. But mud bricks had a secret advantage. They were porous, flexible, and perfectly suited to this harsh environment. Unlike stone, which might crack under temperature swings or fast-moving sandstorms, mud brick walls absorbed the heat and released it slowly, keeping interiors cool and resisted the abrasive desert winds better than you'd expect. Of course, mud brick structures weren't built to last forever. Rain was the enemy, and though the Nile flooding was predictable and mostly helpful, unexpected rainstorms could cause chaos, turning once solid bricks back into mud puddles. To fight this, Egyptians often coated walls with layers of plaster or whitewash, acting like a desert sunscreen, protecting their homes from the elements. These protective coatings gave their villages an almost ethereal glow under the hot sun, a far cry from the dusty, crumbling brown you might imagine. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of mudbrick construction was its sheer scale and social significance. We tend to think of ancient Egypt as all pyramids and temples, but the reality was sprawling urban centers made up entirely of these sun-baked bricks. Workers' houses, markets, storage facilities, and even defensive walls sprang up from this gritty material. Entire neighborhoods, whole cities, emerged with this surprisingly simple technique. It was a great equalizer. The same materials built the dwellings of humble laborers and powerful magistrates alike. This widespread use of mudbrick architecture also tells us a lot about how this civilization was organized. The production of bricks was often a communal effort. Farmers, craftsmen, and laborers alike would help in making and drying these bricks, especially during the Nile's flood season, when the fields were submerged and farming was on pause. In a way, mudbrick production was a social glue, binding the community through shared labor. Imagine millions of bricks made by hand each year, stacked like giant sandcastles across a landscape that seemed destined for sand and dust alone. And then there's the flip side, a gritty reminder that Egyptian life wasn't just golden chariots and pharaoh glamour. Houses made of mudbrick were warm in winter, sure, but not exactly cozy. Dust seeped through cracks, and sand infiltrated every corner, often drifting in like an unwelcome, grainy roommate. It crept under doors, ground into bedding, and coated every surface. Cleaning was a constant battle against nature's slow invasion. Yet, these buildings stood the test of time better than you might think. Some remnants of these mudbrick masterpieces survive today, giving archaeologists a vivid snapshot of ancient urban life. The layouts of neighborhoods, the dimensions of homes, even subtle changes in brick size and composition revealed decades, even centuries of evolving architectural techniques and social changes. Looking closely at these mud brick blocks, you see more than just building materials. You're holding a piece of history shaped by sweat, dust, and sheer determination. They embody the gritty reality of desert life, where survival depended on mastering the fine line between earth and sand. Mudbrick was the literal platform on which an incredible civilization rose, layer by dusty layer. So next time you think of ancient Egypt, don't just picture mighty pyramids or grand temples carved in stone. Remember the mudbrick, sun-baked, straw-reinforced, gritty bricks that filled the dusty cities and held a civilization together. They were the unsung heroes of Egyptian architecture, modest yet resilient, shaping the lives of millions who lived and died in the shadow of the Nile's relentless sands. Because sometimes history isn't just about shining monuments. It's about the gritty, grainy stuff that keeps the world standing. Imagine waking up to the soft crunch beneath your feet, not the plush carpet or cold tile we expect today, but a fine, grainy layer of sand that refuses to be ignored. For the ancient Egyptians, sand wasn't just the relentless backdrop of their vast deserts. It was an uninvited but ever-present roommate inside their very homes. this wasn't some noble element reserved for ceremonial or construction purposes alone. Sand was everywhere, coarse and gritty, sneaking into every corner and every cooked meal. It was both a villain and a secret ally in daily life. Now, don't picture some elegant palace magically immune to this intruder. Whether you were a pharaoh lounging on a lavish daybed or a craftsman in a modest mud brick dwelling, the unyielding granules of sand had a way of getting under your skin, literally. You could sweep and wash, but layers of sand reappeared, as if the desert could not be contained or tamed, stubbornly reclaiming its territory. Yet, as vexing as this may sound, sand wasn't just a nuisance knocking on the door. It shaped the rhythm of household chores and culinary arts in surprisingly practical ways. Take food preparation, for example. The ancient Egyptians had diets rich in grains like barley and emmer wheat, which they ground into flour to bake their legendary flatbreads. Surprisingly, sand played a gritty supporting role in this process. Grain stored in clay jars could become contaminated with fine grit blown in from outside. When these grains were ground on stone querns, basically ancient grinding wheels, the inevitable presence of sand actually did something unexpected. It acted like an abrasive, polishing the grain into finer flour, but also introducing unwanted specks into the meal. Bread often had a distinct crunch, not just from grains, but from the tiny, stubborn bits of sand that refused to be sifted out. You have to picture biting into a warm, freshly baked, unleavened loaf, and halfway through, suddenly hitting what felt like a tiny chip of glass. It was life with literal grit. No one enjoyed this, but everyone endured it. And in fact, some bakers took advantage of sand's abrasive nature to lighten their workload. The presence of gritty particles in the grain helped speed up the milling process, unintentionally automating what might otherwise have been hours of laborious grinding. A bitter trade-off: more sand, faster flour, and bread that left your teeth in a state of mild irritation. And cooking itself was a sandy affair. Hearths were often built on packed earth mixed with sand, and pottery holding stews or grains shared the same destiny. Ash, sand, and dust would settle into every nook and cranny of the cooking area. Ever wonder how Egyptians managed to clean their cooking vessels? Surprisingly, sand was a crucial ingredient. Instead of modern soaps, they would scour pots and pans with sand as an abrasive agent. Picture scrubbing a stubborn pan after camping. Sand and a little elbow grease were the Egyptian equivalent. This natural scrubbing tool was so effective that it helped prevent the buildup of soot and food residues without chemicals, embracing nature's own cleaning power. But sand's gritty dance with household chores didn't stop at scrubbing pots and baking bread. Cleaning floors and living spaces was a constant battle against a relentless tide of sand. Dirt floors in mudbrick homes were swept with bundles of palm fronds or straw brushes, often stirring more dust into the air than they removed from the ground. Sand was impossible to eliminate entirely. It was slippery in the heat, gritty underfoot, and a persistent irritant that scratched skin and irritated eyes. Still, rather than fight it endlessly, the Egyptians learned to coexist with it, using sand itself to help clean. For example, sand was sprinkled on valued carpets and fabrics before beating them to release dirt, a method surprisingly close to modern dry cleaning concepts. The abrasive nature of sand dislodged trapped dust, making textiles fresher without causing damage. In a twist of everyday irony, the very element that invaded their lives also helped maintain cleanliness in a way that water alone could not. This was especially vital in a desert climate, where water was precious and often too mucky or scarce for constant washing. Sand was free, abundant, and multi-purpose. It was a cleansing paradox, abrasive, gritty, and yet essential. This gritty coexistence extended even to personal hygiene. Ancient Egyptians are famous for their obsession with cleanliness and cosmetics, but scrubbing skin to a radiant glow in the desert was no easy task. Sand played the role of a natural exfoliant, replacing modern scrubs with its coarse texture. Egyptians would use fine sand or ground pumice stones to remove dead skin cells and calluses, polishing their hands and feet in preparation for religious rituals or social stimuli. In this context, sand was no longer the enemy, but a beauty secret, if a somewhat rough one. Yet the relationship with sand was far from romantic. Children playing inside homes would often find little grains inside their belongings, caused by their parents' eternal struggle to keep sand at bay. Ancient Egyptian letters and poems mention sand in the eyes and sand in the food as unfortunate miseries, highlighting how ingrained this irritant was in both daily conversation and metaphor. It wasn't a problem they could easily fix, but a constant presence that shaped the very texture of life, sometimes literally. The phrase, living with sand as a roommate, may sound whimsical now, but for ancient Egyptians, it was an unyielding reality. In essence, sand was the everyday companion the Egyptians could neither fully embrace nor banish. It was in their flour, in their cleaning routines, and underfoot. It scratched their skin, added character to their bread, and polished their cooking pots. Yet, without sand's ever-present grit, many tasks would have been more arduous, many chores more time-consuming, and many comforts diminished. So, next time you complain about a bit of sand in your shoes after a beach day, spare a thought for the ancient Egyptians who shared their homes and their meals with an unyielding, grainy roommate that colored every facet of their daily life. Gritty, stubborn, indispensable, the sand that shaped their world was no mere backdrop, but a vital actor in the drama of survival against the desert's relentless embrace. Imagine waking up every day not to the smell of fresh air or the chirping of birds, but to a blanket of fine, abrasive dust sneaking into every crevice of your life. For the ancient Egyptians, sand wasn't just some distant desert nuisance. It was an uninvited, ever-present roommate, scrawling its gritty signature on every breath they took and every blink they dared to muster. The Nile's fertile banks couldn't mute the whistle of drifting sand, stirred by relentless winds that seemed to mock any attempt at shelter. If you thought city smog was bad, try inhaling a cocktail of microparticles, mineral grit, and organic dust every single day for decades. The ancient Egyptians lived with this invisible torment. It gets under your skin, literally. Respiratory troubles were the bane of everyday existence. Chronic coughs, relentless wheezing, and shortness of breath might sound like modern complaints tied to pollution and cigarettes, but in ancient Egypt, these afflictions trace their roots to something more elemental: the ubiquitous sand. The tiny particles, finer than sugar grains, infiltrated lungs repeatedly, causing infections and, over time, scarred tissue. Think of it like early-stage sandpaper working its way down the windpipe and parking stubbornly in the lungs. Archaeological analyses of mummies reveal signs of respiratory diseases similar to chronic bronchitis and asthma. Some scholars even speculate that sand-borne parasites contributed to these ailments, hitchhiking into the respiratory system amidst the swirl of desert air. The Nile Valley, known for its fertility and life, also incubated a less visible, insidious health hazard. There were no inhalers or antibiotics. Treatment meant centuries-old remedies, passed down through generations, a mix of medicine, magic, and stubborn hope. Eye problems, oh, they were just as persistent. The sand wasn't content with just invading lungs. It had a personal vendetta against the eyes. Imagine squinting constantly, not from bright sunlight alone, but from the cruel sting of microscopic grit, sand blasting the corneas day after merciless day. Conjunctivitis was rampant. Eyes reddened and swollen from the relentless barrage, often leading to infections that sometimes turned sightless. The ancient Egyptians had a keen awareness of these issues, and their medical papyri are filled with astonishing insights. Remedies included poultices made from ingredients like honey and nutron, a natural salt sea brew that acted as mild antiseptics. They crafted eye drops from a concoction of crushed antimony and other minerals, sometimes rubbing soothing oils into the temples and around the eyes to quell the burning. Some of these treatments reveal an impressive understanding of antiseptic properties long before germ theory. Magic spells also played a role. Healing incantations weren't just superstition, they were as much a balm for the mind as the body. Yet it wasn't just the health consequences that shaped daily life. It influenced behavior, social customs, even fashion. Ever wondered why those flowing white linen robes are such a hallmark of Egyptian imagery? Besides reflecting sunlight, the light fabrics helped brush off sand rather than trap it close to the skin. Head coverings weren't just worn for style or status. Turbans and simple cloth wraps shielded the scalp and forehead from direct sandblast. Protective measures or a form of resilience, the ancient equivalent of wearing a mask on a dusty city subway. There's an almost dark humor to the idea that the desert was a silent, ceaseless enemy invading one's personal space with such tiny weapons. It doesn't roar or stampede. It sneaks inside with a whisper and grinds you down piece by piece. Yet, for all their complaints, carved into the walls of ancient tombs are images showing men and women wiped with dust, fans swishing and eyes protected carefully. The Egyptians endured. Their resilience was remarkable. Managing to thrive in such a hostile environment attests to a tough spirit, married to ingenuity and a surprisingly advanced grasp of health and hygiene. But imagine the daily insects these sands brought with them. Not just dust, but the detritus of the desert. Small particles that could carry bacteria, spores, and other microscopic threats. Everyone from laborers to noble scribes was vulnerable. It was, in a sense, the invisible epidemic of antiquity. We tend to romanticize ancient Egypt through gleaming pyramids and golden artifacts, glossing over the gritty, grimy reality beneath the gloss, a place where a simple breath of fresh air was a dubious concept. Even funerary practices provide clues about the pervasiveness of sand's presence in life and death. The elaborate use of natron to dry out corpses was partly practical to prevent decay, but also symbolic, purifying the body and removing the dust-clogged remnants of life. Sand wasn't just a nuisance, it was part of the cosmic order, at once a life-giver and a slow, ceaseless destroyer. Of course, the Egyptians weren't alone in coping with these sandy suffocations. Desert peoples worldwide have always had to develop ways to deal with such incessant irritants. But in the valley cradled by the Great Nile, sand took on a particularly intimate role, insinuating itself not just into homes or streets, but into the very breath and sight of those who shaped one of history's most remarkable civilizations. So the next time you happily complain about a speck of dust in your eye or a bit of sand in your shoe at the beach, spare a thought for those ancient souls who welcomed the sand as a roommate, whether they liked it or not, because in their world, there was simply no escape, only endurance, innovation, and a humor touched with grit. Imagine wearing a garment that feels like a gentle breeze kissing your skin, yet it's constantly infiltrated by tiny, relentless particles of sand. For the ancient Egyptians, this wasn't a fashion nightmare, but their everyday fabric reality. Sand wasn't just the backdrop of their civilization, it was an uninvited, ever-present roommate that shaped the very threads they wore. The desert, with its ceaselessly shifting dunes and unforgiving sun, dictated fashion in ways we rarely pause to consider. You might think that sand simply settled as an irritating nuisance, but it penetrated every fiber of daily life, quite literally. The clothes of ancient Egypt emerged not just from aesthetic desire, but as an adaptive necessity to the gritty environment. Linen, the star fabric of Egyptian attire, might sound gentle and elegant, but it was the product of intense and often sand-swept labor. Harvested from flax plants cultivated along the Nile's fertile banks, linen was prized for its breathability, a vital quality when your main outdoor companion is a blazing desert sun and airborne grains of sand that never quit. Unlike the heavy, heat-trapping wool that dominated in colder regions, linen let the skin breathe while offering a certain resilience against the abrasive environment. But how did they spin such fine cloth when the process itself was riddled with sandy complications? Flax fibers are delicate, and working them near the desert meant sand could sneak in, dulling tools or snagging on the threads. Spinners and weavers likely developed a cautious dance, working quickly, sometimes indoors, and constantly brushing off grainy invaders to preserve their thread's integrity. Imagine trying to knit a sweater while half a sandstorm sneaks into your workshop. Now picture doing that while kneading that sweater to protect you from sand. It's a bit like battling your own dusty nemesis. The weave itself was surprisingly fine, almost gauzy in texture, which played into a crucial function: ventilation. The linen garments of ancient Egypt were often surprisingly sheer, light enough to feel like a second skin that let heat escape and sweat evaporate. This wasn't just for comfort or style, but a defensive measure against the oppressive heat amplified by the sun-baked desert ground. But here's the kicker: the very environment that needed to be guarded against, sand, also challenged the durability of these threads. Sand can act like millions of tiny logos of abrasion, grinding against fabric with every step or gust, threatening to fray even the toughest woven linen. Ancient Egyptians might have employed surprisingly practical solutions, like double layers or tight weaving, to create a fabric that resisted tearing, mimicking armor, but in the form of everyday clothing. Think of it as the first filter-texture combo, protecting the wearer from the desert abrasive touch, while maintaining a lightness that would keep their skin from frying. It wasn't just the fabric's weave that played a role, but also the way clothes were worn and layered. The typical Egyptian wardrobe might appear minimal by modern standards: kilts, wraps, sheer dresses, but each piece was selected and arranged carefully. Wraps were often tied in such a way to shield the upper arms or shoulders, organs particularly sensitive to sunburn and sand chafing. In some instances, broad collars and sashes weren't merely decorative, but functioned like mini beach umbrellas for the neck area, throwing shade where you needed it most. For those who could afford it, finely crushed minerals and oils were sometimes rubbed into linen before donning, creating a subtle sheen and a touch of additional protection. These treatments might have made garments more resistant to both sand and sweat, a bit like applying a skincare barrier, but on cloth. The rich would parade not only in stylish linens, but in fabrics that kept nature's coarse grit at bay, while poorer folks likely had to endure the full brunt of sand's infiltrations in their more basic, less treated attire. It's fascinating to picture daily life in this way. Garments that may appear fragile to modern eyes were in fact a deliberate balance. They had to fend off sunburn, capture cool air, and hold firm against the micro scratches of desert sand, all while flaunting status, fertility, or religious symbols. Clothes were part armor, part air conditioning, and part billboard, all wrapped into one. Beyond personal clothing, the influence of the desert sand extended to ceremonies and rituals involving textiles. Linen shrouds, wrappings, and symbolic dress bore the imprint of mastering a land's harshness. The elegance of Egyptian funerary linens, for instance, came with the silent knowledge that outside the tomb, every fiber was exposed to the merciless sandstorms that could quickly turn delicate fabric into punishment for the skin. This gritty reality also amplified the social significance of clothing. A person's linen was a silent statement of their ability to navigate desert adversity. Carrying a torn or thin cloth wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a daily humiliation reinforced by the endless influx of sand. How you maintained your garment was a mark of your station and your resilience. Keeping sand out, both physically and symbolically, meant preserving dignity amid an environment that seemed designed to wear you down. In many ways, the ancient Egyptians were masters of a tough balancing act, crafting wardrobes that were simultaneously fragile and formidable, simple yet sophisticated, all under the relentless presence of their sandy companion. The sand was more than just grains. It was a sculptor of culture, influencing not just buildings and cities, but the very fabric that touched their skin. So next time you feel a grain of sand slipping into your shoe or down your shirt, think of those ancient weavers and wearers, people who turned the desert's abrasive challenge into a fine art of textile survival. Their linen may look delicate to us now, but every thread was a testament to enduring grit, woven with the knowledge that sand was always lurking just beneath the surface. Imagine waking up one morning in ancient Egypt to find your entire village swallowed by a suffocating cloud of sand, the sun obliterated by an endless swirling wall of dust and grit. No, it's not the beginning of a dystopian novel or a dramatic movie scene. This was real life for the Egyptians, who lived under the relentless assault of sandstorms that could shred your eyesight before you even had a chance to blink. Sandstorms were the tempestuous tantrums of the desert, nature's ultimate micromanager, poking its granular finger into every nook and cranny of daily existence. These fierce, sand-driven winds, known in ancient times simply as storms of the desert, were about as subtle as a sledgehammer at a glass workshop. Picture a monstrous dust cloud, thousands of feet high, hurtling across the lands with a ferocity that could bury homes, ruin crops, and turn the once fertile Nile Valley into a bleak, choking expanse of sand. The scale was immense, the power indisputable, and the toll on human lives and livelihoods profoundly significant. But here's the kicker. Egyptians didn't just endure these episodes, they anticipated them. They became the original weather forecasters, albeit with less technology and more intuition. Farmers and traders kept a wary eye on the horizon, watching for telltale signs, a sudden shift in wind direction, an eerie stillness before the storm's arrival, the strange flicker of heat that signaled the Earth's dryness had gone too far. To the ancient Egyptians, these were not merely random annoyances. They were warnings etched into memory, passed down like sacred knowledge, because failing to recognize an approaching sandstorm could mean catastrophe. Surviving a sandstorm wasn't like ducking inside for a few minutes until the rain passed. No, these storms could rage for hours, sometimes days, leaving behind landscapes so transformed you might question if you'd stumbled into a different world. Villages could be buried under drifts of sand, crops smothered beyond hope, water sources contaminated with fine dust. Breathing itself became a battle as tiny particles infiltrated every crevice, scratching throats and lodging in lungs. Imagine having to rebuild your entire life, not just your house, but your entire sense of normality after a day's ordeal with the desert's fury. Life adapted in ingenious ways. Architecture, for instance, bore the scars and solutions born from these sandy sieges. Walls were built thicker, corners deeper, windows smaller and fewer. Courtyards became essential breathing spaces, protected from gusts by tall protective walls. Doors and shutters were crafted to keep out the wind and its blinding cargo. Sand was sneaky and pervasive. There was simply no total escape. So the Egyptians learned to deal with it, to make peace with the constant gritty companion that stuck to their skin, clogged their tools, and whispered through the cracks. Even daily routines shifted to dodge the worst of the storms. Activities that could be put off, trade caravans, construction, even simple errands, paused or rearranged. Imagine a bustling marketplace suddenly silenced by the threat of a swirling brown tempest blotting out the sun. A city had to hunker down, shutter shops, seal windows, and pray that the storm's anger would abate before transforming the streets into a hazardous mess of slick sand and debris. The emotional weight of sandstorms was heavy too. Sandstorms often carried with them a psychological toll, the uncertainty and terror of not knowing if your home and your life would be buried forever. For a society so focused on order, stability, and the eternal flow of the Nile. These brutal interruptions were harsh reminders of nature's indifference. They intruded upon the rhythms of worship, harvest, and governance, often interpreted through the spiritual lens as omens or divine displeasure. And yet, in a twist worthy of ancient Egyptian resilience, these very storms may have helped shape the civilization itself. The very fact that Egypt's agriculture relied so heavily on the Nile's regular flooding meant that any additional chaos, like a sandstorm smothering the land, was a dangerous gamble. The Egyptians' obsession with order in life and afterlife was in part a response to nature's unpredictable fury. Temples, tombs, and monumental archives weren't just eternal monuments to pharaohs, they were bulwarks against the chaos that sand and wind sought to unleash. In this light, sandstorms were not just a natural hazard, but a constant catalyst in the forging of Egyptian cultural and spiritual identity. The Egyptians even devised practical tools and techniques to fight back against the sand's encroachment. Workers cleared roads and fields, sweeping away the relentless debris like gardeners battling weeds. Water channels were cleaned and maintained to prevent them from being choked by sand. The very art of irrigation can be seen as a battlefront against desert encroachment, a deliberate attempt to impose life and order where desert wanted only desolation. Perhaps the most evocative image of this battle comes from their writing and art. Often, scribes depicted swirling clouds of sand as malevolent spirits or divine forces. Pharaohs were shown crushing enemies who could easily be interpreted as chaotic sand and desert spirits, a metaphor for reigning over the uncontrollable natural world. The desert was both a physical and spiritual frontier, the place where order ended and chaos began. And sandstorms were the heralds of that chaos, arriving with a vengeance and leaving behind the gritty residue of their wrath. So next time you think of Egypt, forget the sun-drenched pyramids bathed in golden light just for a moment. Imagine instead the gritty, deafening roar of a relentless sandstorm as it blots out the world, a swirling cyclone of doubt, dust, and danger that demanded respect, caution, and a stubborn streak of survival. To live alongside sandstorms was to accept that nature's fury could arrive at any moment, unannounced and unwelcome. And yet, the ancient Egyptians endured, adapted, and even learned to anticipate the desert's gritty tantrums, turning each storm into a chapter of survival mastery, a testament to their remarkable resilience in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Sand is everywhere in ancient Egypt, on your feet, in your food, under your nails, even as a stubborn, sparkly roommate in the fields where the world's first farmers toiled endlessly. It wasn't just a nuisance. Sand was both a curse and a blessing, a relentless adversary and an unexpected ally. To understand ancient Egyptian agriculture is to understand this gritty relationship. Picture the vast Nile Valley, stretching out like a golden carpet framed by deserts. It looks beautiful, serene, but beneath that calm surface, the land was a battlefield every farming season. The worst enemy? Sam's less glamorous role: abrasive, invasive, suffocating. Far from the idyllic image of fertile farmlands, Egyptian farmers wrestled with soil that was at times more desert than dirt. Here's the deal. Sand on its own is terrible for crops. Anyone who's tried to grow anything in pure sand knows this instinctively. It drains water faster than a camel can sneak away at sunset and refuses to hold on to nutrients. Imagine pouring your paycheck down a leaky bucket. Difficult, right? The ancient Egyptians had to fight exactly this problem on the margins of their fields. Before the Nile's annual miracle, fields bordering the main delta and valley sides were drier and sandier. Without the floodwaters to replenish them, these places were grim. Sand blew in relentlessly, like nature's sandpaper, scraping away at the clumps of earth, stripping away precious topsoil, and damaging any tender plants brave enough to sprout. When the farmers sowed millet or barley into these gritty patches, the seeds often got buried beneath or blown away entirely. If the sand wasn't killjoy enough, it also held heat like a furnace, roasting young crops right out of their dreams. Hardly the nurturing environment for a civilization that depended on steady harvests. But, and here's where it gets fascinating, sand wasn't the eternal villain. The Nile's rhythm transformed the gritty desert soil into an agricultural superstar every year. The legendary flooding wasn't just about water. It brought silt, that fine, nutrient-rich sediment that settled onto the fields as the floodwaters receded. This silt was capitalism's bonus, a natural fertilizer packing everything plants craved: minerals, organic matter, and moisture-retaining particles. Without this annual sand rescue mission, Egypt might have remained a desert wasteland, a vast stretch of inhospitable dunes. Instead, it gained a patchwork of surprisingly fertile fields, fertile enough to support a civilization that thrived for thousands of years. But it wasn't just a happy accident. This delicate balance between sand as destroyer and sand as giver shaped farming techniques, planting calendars, and even social organization. Egyptian farmers became masters of timing. Floodwaters could be their best friends or their cruelest tormentors. Arrive too early, and you risk losing seeds to drifting sand and drought-cracked soil. Arrive too late, and the land becomes a salty, unusable mess as leftover water evaporates and leaves behind mineral deposits that choke plant roots like poison ivy. Farmers watched the river with a mix of hope and anxiety, their entire year balanced on this natural metronome, to harness the fertility of silt while keeping sand's abrasiveness at bay. They developed ingenious methods. Canals and basins were dug to trap floodwaters long enough for the silt to settle, while excess sand was pushed back or allowed to dry out and blow away. Fields closer to the desert were protected with mud bricks or walls of reeds, careful barricades against blowing sandstorms. When sand did invade, farmers would sometimes clear their fields by hand, a tedious but necessary task. Sand removal ceremonies might sound exaggerated, but to them it was as crucial as prayer in the temple. What's striking is how the agricultural calendar itself intertwined with the sandy reality. Planting was not merely a chore, but a race against the clock and against the whims of nature's gritty roommate. The inundation season first washed away the salt and brought fresh topsoil. Then came planting season, when the earth was soft, moist, and alive with possibility, followed by the growing season, where every grain of sand mattered. By harvest time, farmers had to be vigilant against desert winds that could strip the crops clean, leaving nothing but air and despair. The Egyptians' ability to ride this fine line between chaos and control speaks volumes about human resilience. They weren't just passive victims of nature. They were architects of an agricultural miracle built on understanding, adapting to, and sometimes fighting sand itself. It was a relationship full of compromises, accepting sand's inevitability, but constantly combating its excesses. Of course, the sand wasn't just a static problem. Over centuries, environmental changes could tip the scales. Diminished Nile floods, shifts in wind patterns, or periods of drought made sand's destructive role even harsher. Crop failures meant famine, social unrest, or worse. So the story of Egyptian farming is not just about crops. It's about survival in a land where sand was the silent, gritty roommate everyone wished they could evict, but never could. This interplay of sand, silt, flood, and earth shaped not only agriculture, but also mythology, ritual, and daily life. The Egyptians worshipped the Nile as a god because it was their sole guarantor against ruin. Every grain of sand discarded, every seed planted in silt-enriched soil, became a testament to the fragile balance sustaining one of history's greatest civilizations. In the end, ancient Egyptian farmers lived with sand always looming, a rough, unrelenting presence that could strangle life, but also bore the seeds of renewal. The soil might have seemed like an unyielding desert, but with patience, knowledge, and sheer grit, pun absolutely intended, they turned that same sand into the cradle of civilization. A tricky roommate, yes, but one that shaped the very destiny of Egypt's enduring legacy. Imagine living in a world where the grains of sand beneath your feet are not just a nuisance to be brushed off, but the very foundation of your crafting marvels. For the ancient Egyptians, sand wasn't just something to dodge on the dusty streets or curse when it got into your scrolls and sandals. It was the gritty, scratchy partner in crime, shaping their daily lives and extraordinary creations. Sand was everywhere, an omnipresent force in the desert landscape, and the Egyptians, ever resourceful, didn't shy away from making it work for them. This was not just about brushing sand out of your eyes after a sudden gust. It was about seeing potential in those tiny abrasive particles and transforming them into the building blocks of art, science, and everyday life. When most people today think about sand, it's usually just a beach backdrop to a vacation. But for the ancient Egyptians, it was raw material, weapon, and silent companion rolled into one. Take glass, for example. The very word conjures images of fragile windows and elegant drinkware. But in ancient Egypt, glassmaking was a mystical alchemy born from sand and fire, turning something extremely common into something extraordinarily valuable. Egyptians discovered that heating pure quartz sand with natron, a naturally occurring soda ash, at high temperatures could melt the sand's silicon dioxide into a molten form, which, when cooled, became glass. This process was cutting-edge science for its time and required precise control over temperature and ingredients. The resulting glass was dazzling and colorful, often fashioned into beads, amulets, and small vessels that glittered like jewels under the harsh Egyptian sun. It's easy to take glass for granted now, just another thing you find in your cup or on your phone screen. But in ancient Egypt, glass was precious and rare, almost magical. It could mimic the colors of precious stones: turquoise blues, deep greens, fiery reds. The palette was a mimicry of the surrounding natural beauty, but encased in man-made brilliance. Imagine the crafting floors, filled with the smoke and heat from kilns, where artisans shaped this molten sand into objects carrying spiritual and social significance. It was serious business. The difference between a common pot and a royal amulet might be the glass beads threading through it. But glass was just one chapter in this gritty saga. Pottery, that humble yet indispensable part of daily Egyptian existence, also owed its very existence to sand. If you picture ancient Egyptian life, you might imagine ornate temples and towering obelisks. But the vast majority of their pottery was utilitarian: jars for storing grain, bowls for preparing food, and vessels to ferry water from the Nile. Clay alone is too sticky and soft. You need a little grit to toughen it up and prevent your finely crafted bowl from collapsing into a sad, shapeless mess as it dries or is fired. That's where sand came in. Mixed in, it acted like an ancient form of fiberglass, adding strength and resilience. This addition wasn't just some happy accident. It was a deliberate, calculated choice. Artisans discovered that the right balance of sand in clay meant their pots could survive the heat of the kitchen fire and endure the rigors of travel and storage. Without it, containers might crack, leak, or simply fall apart the moment you filled them with water or grains. So the sand in those vessels was an unsung hero. It may have felt rough against their hands while shaping the clay, but it was the difference between food safely stored and a household disaster. And then there were the grinding stones, the gritty tools that turned wheat into flour, seeds into oil, and hopes of a full meal into reality. These were literally the daily breadmaker's instruments, tough discs of sandstone and quartz cemented together, abrasive and unforgiving. Without these stones, the simple act of eating would become a luxury rather than a necessity. Every loaf of bread, the sustenance of the masses, depended on those grinding stones' hard work, powered by human arms grinding back and forth, grain upon grain. You have to appreciate the irony here. The very sand that was a constant irritant, getting into everything, from eyes to clothes, was also the essential ingredient in the tools that sustained life. It was an unrelenting presence that shaped the mundane and the magnificent alike. The same abrasive quality that scraped at your skin also polished your pottery, gave structure to your glass, and ground your grain with relentless efficiency. But this grittiness wasn't just physical. It was symbolic too. Sand was the ancient Egyptian version of making lemonade out of lemons. If lemons, what tiny shards of stone that got everywhere and never stopped invading your personal space. Their world was harsh, sun-baked, and abrasive, but they harnessed those challenges with ingenuity and sheer stubbornness. Instead of cursing the desert, they mined it for resources, turned raw and unpleasant into polished and precious. It's worth pausing to marvel at that entrepreneurial spirit writ large on ancient history's canvas. The Egyptians didn't just survive the sand, they built their civilization because of it. Their cities, art, rituals, and daily necessities all leaned on this humble, granular substance. The shoreline of the Nile's floodplain and the surrounding deserts provided not just a dead expanse, but a treasure trove of silica-packed potential. And look at it this way. Anyone can admire the grandeur of Egyptian monuments and tombs, but the real magic was in the little, gritty, grainy details. The sand in their pottery, the sand turned to glass in their artisans' kilns, the sand that filled their grinding stones, tirelessly transforming raw grain into nourishing bread. This was the backdrop to every banquet or burial feast. The next time you brush sand off your shoes, maybe you'll think for a moment about how 4,000 years ago, those same grains weren't just an irritating nuisance, but a cornerstone of civilization. The ancient Egyptians didn't just live with the sand, they invited it inside and let it shape their world. Gritty, stubborn, and endlessly useful, the perfect roommate. Imagine waking up every day with sand in your hair, sand in your clothes, sand in places you didn't even know could hold sand. Well, for the ancient Egyptians, that gritty companion was more than just an annoyance. It was woven deeply into the fabric of their spiritual and mythological worldview. Sand was more than just the stuff you swept off your floor or kicked off your sandals. It was a symbol, a sacred substance, and sometimes even a divine character playing starring roles in their religion. Now, before picturing the Egyptians just swearing at dunes and hoping for a breeze, it's important to understand how this endless, shifting sea of sand shaped not only their geography, but their gods and stories as well. The Egyptians didn't just live beside the desert, they embraced its mystery, reverence, and yes, even its annoyances. To them, the desert wasn't an empty wasteland. It was a spiritual frontier, a place where myth and reality blurred, and where sand transformed from mere grit into a symbol of chaos, purity, and rebirth. Take Set, for example, the god of deserts, storms, and the wild unknown. Set was the original bad boy of Egyptian mythology, a trickster figure who embodied disorder but was crucial to the balance of things. His domain? The barren, unyielding desert sands rolling beyond the fertile Nile banks where civilization clung precariously. The dry, hot, and harsh landscape he ruled was a stark contrast to the lush, cultivated lands the Egyptians called home. Set's association with sand wasn't accidental. The chaotic nature of the desert's shifting dunes mirrored his unpredictable and destructive personality. He was both feared and respected, much like the desert itself, which could kill you with heat or swallow you whole in a sudden sandstorm. But here's the twist. The sand wasn't all doom and gloom. While Set and the desert symbolized danger, sand also held powerful symbolic meanings in Egyptian rituals and beliefs connected to creation and protection. For instance, the ancient Egyptians saw creation as an emergence from a primordial chaos, a watery, formless abyss. The first dry land, called the Benben, arose like a pyramid-shaped mound of earth and sand from these waters, marking the beginning of life and order. In temple art and mythology, this mound of sand was a sacred spot. It was the stage where the sun god Ra began his daily journey, bringing light and life to the world. Sand, in this sense, was the stuff from which existence itself was forged, a divine platform balancing between the chaotic depths and the ordered world. Sand also appeared in the rituals of protection and purification. It sounds ironic, right? The very substance that could scratch out your eyes was sprinkled or layered in ceremonies meant to safeguard the soul and home. One reason is practical. Sand absorbs moisture and odor and acts as a barrier. Symbolically, it stood as a protective shield, mimicking the desert's harsh, inhospitable barrier. To touch or sprinkle sand in rituals was to invoke the desert's power against evil spirits or impurities that sought to invade the sanctity of life or the afterlife. And speaking of the afterlife, sand was integral to the Egyptian imagination of death and rebirth. The deserts were often seen as a liminal space, the boundary between the living and the dead. Tombs, after all, were carved into rock faces fringed by desert sands. Sand covered these eternal resting places, both hiding and protecting them from vandals and the destructive floods of the Nile. More than a mere guardian, the desert sand symbolized the endless cycle of death and regeneration. Like the dunes constantly reshaped by wind, death was not an end, but a transformation. In some funerary texts, the dead were described as traveling across the desert to reach the afterlife, crossing perilous sandy plains, to join the gods. Think about that journey, daunting, arduous, and endless. But traversing the desert sand was also a rite of passage, a spiritual trial testing one's virtue and strength. Sand wasn't just dirt, it was the crucible where souls were forged for eternity. Even the tools that ancient Egyptians used in religious rites connected metaphorically to sand. Take incense burners, sometimes designed like tiny sand mounds, or the use of powdered substances resembling sand in purification ceremonies. The presence of these gritty particles, whether real or symbolic, was a tangible link between the physical world and the divine mysteries they sought to unravel. You might be surprised to learn that some Egyptian spells and magical texts explicitly invoke sand as part of their enchantments. They called upon sand's ability to blot out or immobilize evil, much like desert storms that sweep away intruders or unwanted spirits. It's almost poetic. Sand, that ever-present grainy irritant, turning into a kind of holy firewall against unseen threats. All this paints a picture of sand as something paradoxical, a humble and irritating element of daily life that, layered through culture and belief, transformed into a symbol of chaos and order alike. It was both the battleground and the birthplace of gods, the protector of tombs, and a metaphor for life's gritty, relentless cycles. So next time you brush sand from your shoes after a beach trip, or curse a particularly sandy sidewalk, remember, for the ancient Egyptians, sand was never just a nuisance. It was an intimate part of the divine dance between destruction and creation, chaos and order, death and rebirth. It was their inescapable spiritual roommate, stirring up both dust and divine intrigue in equal measure. Imagine for a moment the ancient Egyptian desert, stretching endlessly under a blistering sun, a sea of shifting golden grains that might seem hostile, barren, and unforgiving. Yet for the Egyptians, this endless sand wasn't just the backdrop for life and death. It was an active player, a silent partner in one of the most crucial aspects of their existence, the journey to the afterlife. Sand, that annoying little particle that gets in your eyes, your food, and supposedly your eternal peace, turned out to be vital in the burial practices of ancient Egypt. If you thought sand was just something to distract you at the beach, think again. It was maybe the best roommate an Egyptian pharaoh could hope for when it came to preserving their legacy. At first glance, the connection between deadly, arid sand and the elaborate rituals of death might seem odd, but the Egyptians had an intimate understanding of their environment. Every grain of desert sand was a piece of the puzzle in their spiritual and practical approach to death. The desert's relentless dry heat and coarse granules weren't just a nuisance. They became natural guardians of the tomb, a gritty shield against decay and time. Let's get specific. The ancient Egyptians believed the soul embarked on a perilous voyage to the afterlife, lined with dangers and obstacles, requiring protection and preservation of the physical body. Enter the imposing sand. When tombs were carved into the rocky cliffs or built in sandy plains, the surrounding sand acted like a giant natural desiccant, as if nature herself was their embalmer. The dry environment sucked moisture out relentlessly, preventing the decomposition bacteria from thriving, which you might say is an ancient version of an ultra-eco-friendly crypt. No refrigeration needed. Actually, this natural mummification process was no accident or divine coincidence. Egyptians, ever the pragmatists, understood that sand was a powerful ally. When bodies were wrapped and prepared for burial, the grave's sandy environs worked in tandem with embalming techniques. The sand's coarse texture didn't just keep moisture away, it helped inhibit animals and insects that might otherwise feast on the corpse. Imagine a hungry desert beetle trying to burrow through endless layers of abrasive sand. It's like a microscopic Sahara fortress. But wait, there's more. Sand also played a symbolic role that was as intricate as the physical one. It wasn't just the practical stuff of preserving flesh. It was an element tied tightly to Egyptian cosmology. The desert represented chaos, the sprawling realm of the god Set, but it also worked as a barrier between the world of the living and the afterlife. By surrounding the tombs with sand, the Egyptians effectively cordoned off the dead, creating a liminal space. This gritty barrier was both a physical and spiritual safeguard, a do not disturb sign, but written in millions of tiny grains, some of which would have surely wedged uncomfortably into every nook and cranny of the embalmed body. And if you think the sand stopped at the tomb's perimeter, think again. The very embalming process tapped into sand's properties. Early on, before the weirdly perfect mummies with pristine skin, embalmers discovered that packing the bodies in natron crystals, a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate and bicarbonate, had a saltiness and drying capacity somewhat reminiscent of sand's. It borrowed nature's own desert chemistry. The natron, often combined with desert sand, painstakingly extracted all liquids, sealing the deceased in a near-perfect stasis. Notably, not every mummy was sealed inside a tomb brimming with sand. Some elite individuals had elaborate coffins and burial chambers lined with precious materials. But even then, the bodies were first exposed to sand during dehydration. For the poor or middle classes, sand was the universal embalmer, the great equalizer. There was no elaborate temple crypt, no gold sarcophagus, but the sand did its unglamorous, gritty job, preserving life beyond death. Furthermore, the sand subtly influenced the architecture and location of tombs. The Valley of the Kings, nestled in the arid cliffs, was chosen not just for secrecy, but because the dry desert soil and coarse sand provided the perfect environment for preservation. The interplay of sandy particles, rocks, and the climate created ideal tombs that have lasted millennia. You can think of it as an ancient environmental insurance policy, one that Mother Nature, in the form of billions of stubborn sand grains, paid for generously. And here's a thought to chew on. The same sand that preserved royalty also contributed to the slow degradation of painted tomb walls and delicate papyrus scrolls. Sand is a double-edged sword, the hero and the villain. It kept the bodies intact, but eroded mortality's keepsakes. The tiny abrasive grit, ever present in tombs, slowly wore away at colors and ink, a cautionary tale that even time's greatest preservative has its limits. Perhaps the most poetic role sand played was as a symbol of rebirth and eternity. The endless desert, vast and timeless, reflected the eternal nature of the soul's journey. Just as sand covers the body, burying it under a protective layer, it also represented the eternal cycle of death and resurrection. The endless grains shifting, moving, never truly disappearing, akin to the soul's perpetual voyage through the afterlife. The desert's unforgiving nature was a paradox, brutal to the living, but a cradle to the dead. So, the next time you gripe about sand invading your picnic or sticking to your sunburn, remember that for the ancient Egyptians, sand was a precious, even sacred material. It was the gritty, granular hero that protected their dead, preserved their stories, and carved a cosmic barrier between the earthly and eternal worlds. Without sand, there might be no majestic mummies, no well-preserved tombs echoing with hieroglyphs, no tangible connection bridging thousands of years between us and those timeless desert dwellers. In the end, that ubiquitous grit was more than just dirt. It was the silent guardian of immortality, quietly working beneath the blazing sun to keep the past alive, one grain at a time. Imagine you're a trader in ancient Egypt, tasked with moving precious goods, maybe fine linen, papyrus scrolls, or a stash of exotic spices from thriving Nile cities out into the wide open, merciless wilderness. Your destination? Lands beyond the familiar rhythms of the river, where stone temples and fertile fields give way to relentless dunes, glaring sun, and the dead silence of desert sands. Welcome to the gritty, grainy reality of Egypt's trade routes threading across the Sinai Peninsula, a place where sand wasn't just an environmental feature, it was a stubborn, omnipresent roommate. The desert isn't just empty space to be crossed or tolerated. It was the main character in a vast drama of trade and survival. Picture this: Under a scorching sun, caravans of camels plowed through shifting dunes, hooves and feet sinking into sands so fine and loose they seemed determined to swallow everything whole. But these weren't just aimless wanderers. They were seasoned negotiators with the harshness of the desert, equipped with an intimate knowledge of the terrain, weather patterns, and the midnight mirages that could drive even the steeliest minds insane. The Sinai Peninsula, long a land bridge connecting Africa to Asia, was both a barrier and a gateway, a sandy choke point that funneled trade like the narrow neck of an hourglass. If the Nile was Egypt's shimmering artery of life and commerce, the desert trails carved through Sinai were its gritty capillaries, indispensable but brutal. Merchants crossing these sands had to plan meticulously. There were no rest stops, no roadside diners serving falafel or kebabs, no soothing bottle of cold water at every turn. Instead, there were endless miles of sun-baked earth and abrasive particles that made every tent fold and camel saddle creak with the grind of tiny grains sneaking their way into every crevice. Why risk it all? Because Sinai was a crossroads. To the northeast lay the Levant, gateway to ancient empires like Canaan, and further on, Mesopotamia. To the south stretched the incense-rich realms of Punt, and twisting through those deserts ran precious trade corridors that funneled goods, ideas, and cultures into Egypt's bustling cities. Salt, spices, gold, timber, copper. None of these treasures would reach the Nile without enduring the demanding journey across the arid expanses. Caravans relied heavily on camels, the ships of the desert, who were perfectly adapted to withstand parched conditions and carry heavy loads with a stoic endurance that combined stubbornness and survival genius. But the desert sand was a relentless adversary, even for these tough beasts. Sand's fine grains infiltrated nostrils, eyelashes, hooves, and every inch of fur, causing discomfort that no doubt made the camels and their drivers long for a cool, leafy oasis. Temperatures swung from blistering heat by day to chilling cold at night. Sandstorms were a constant threat, capable of blinding a traveler in seconds and erasing carefully measured paths. Navigating these sands was more science than wandering. Ancient Egyptian traders read the desert like a book. They followed stars, memorized the locations of rare desert plants, and depended on the guidance of Bedouin nomads, people intimately acquainted with every twist and dune, who knew where to find underground water and how to interpret subtle shifts in wind and sand. Without these human compasses, a caravan could easily be swallowed by the endless undulations of pebble-strewn dunes, or wander for days into despair. One of the most infamous challenges along these routes was the so-called Way of the Horus, a dangerous trade road that crossed the northern Sinai, linking Egypt with the Levant. Not only was the sand a physical obstacle, but this stretch was often a hotspot for banditry. Imagine trudging through heat and grit all day, only to face a well-armed ambush come twilight. Merchants had to be vigilant, alert, and often traveled in large groups for sheer safety, turning the trade route into a moving fortress. But what made sand especially maddening wasn't just the physical hardship. It was the psychological whiplash inflicted by the desert's unrelenting sameness. Endless panoramic views of grainy beige and ochre horizons, where landmarks whispered like ghosts, and any sign of life was a cause for jubilation and urgent celebration. The sand could play tricks, turning a scrubby bush into a mirage fruit, or shifting beneath weary feet with the persistence of a grating Rube Goldberg trap set against human comfort. Travelers learned to expect discomfort, to accept a certain level of grit. Sand was in your clothes, your food, your skin, and your soul. Trade routes were lifelines, and sand was the price of admission. To make these journeys possible, Egyptians developed complex networks of way stations and oases, scattered like precious jewels across the Sinai's arid throne. These were places to rest, refresh, and resupply, brief havens where grainy throats could swallow cool water from wells dug deep beneath the desert bedrock. Yet, even oases were subject to the fickleness of the desert climate and political control. Securing them often meant territorial disputes, fortifications, and a careful balance of diplomacy. The unforgiving environment also influenced what goods were transported and how. Heavy, fragile items were rarely moved directly across the desert. Instead, goods often changed carriers or were repackaged to endure the rigors of travel. The careful preparation of cargo was an art form, wrapping delicate spices, ceramics, or rolled papyrus against the sand's abrasive sting. Traders themselves often dressed in layered linens that could be wrapped tightly, shielding skin from burning sun and gritty winds. Face veils weren't just fashion statements, they were semi-permeable barriers against the constant influx of fine abrasive particles. Despite the sand's relentless invasion, these trade routes thrived for centuries, carving conductions not only in physical space, but in the cultural and economic fabric of ancient Egypt and its neighbors. They carried more than goods. They ferried languages, religious symbols, metallurgic techniques, and artistic styles. Even the soldiers, who sometimes accompanied caravans to fend off desert raiders, carried stories and grains of sand far beyond the borders of the Nile Valley. Next time you gaze at a pile of sand, whether on a beach or a playground, remember that in the ancient world, sand was not some innocent childhood companion. It was a merciless roommate, an uninvited guest, and a formidable foe responsible for shaping the course of some of history's most legendary commercial journeys. The desert's grains may be small and seemingly insignificant, but collectively they forged the incredible, messy, and enduring networks that brought riches and connections to Egypt and beyond. Imagine for a moment the sensation of sand underfoot, those tiny granules that slip between your toes, sneak into your shoes, and manage to find their way into every impossible crevice of your life. Now picture that feeling stretched across the entirety of one of history's most fascinating civilizations. For the ancient Egyptians, sand wasn't just a landscape feature, it was an omnipresent roommate, forcing its gritty presence into every corner of existence, including the very language and symbols they used to understand their world. We often think of hieroglyphics as pristine little pictures carved and painted with antiseptic precision. But scratch beneath that surface, and the desert's omnipotent dust is embedded not only in their stories, but in their words themselves. Sand, quite literally, shaped how the Egyptians communicated, thought, and even expressed emotion. What's extraordinary is how this ubiquitous grit lent a kind of textured realism to their language, making it a living reflection of their ever-sandy reality. Take, for example, the hieroglyph for sand. It looks almost like a ripple across a grainy surface, a neat zigzag that seems simplistic, but carries the weight of an entire ecosystem. This symbol wasn't just about literal sand, it was versatile, appearing as part of words describing vague notions of granularness, time, and even chaos. Now, that might sound strange to our modern ears. How does sand connect to time or chaos? But in the Egyptian worldview, the desert was both a timeless expanse and a chaotic force, one that threatened the order the Nile brought to their existence. One particularly striking expression was the word desher, often translated as grain or sand, but its connotations went deeper. It was a term laced with the idea of multiplicity and smallness, of countless tiny bits making up a whole. Imagine trying to explain countless without using any abstract concepts. The Egyptians grabbed sand, literal sand, and used it as a metaphor. It's as if they said, "See all these grains? That's how many there are." If you think about it, that's pretty much how we still use sand and grains today. Countless, innumerable, microscopic units, an ancient meme passed down through millennia. Even emotionally laden hieroglyphs weren't immune to the sandy metaphor. When Egyptians wanted to talk about vulnerability or fragility, they'd sometimes invoke the image of sand slipping away through fingers, something impossible to grasp fully, yet impossible to ignore. Sand morphed into a metaphor for things you try to hold on to, but inevitably lose. It's poetic, but there's also something agonizingly raw about it, reflecting the harshness of everyday Egyptian life, where survival often felt just as ephemeral as grains slipping through fingers. Language aside, the gritty texture of sand seeped into stories and idioms too, granting a dusty tang to everyday wisdom and myth alike. They had expressions equivalent to our between a rock and a hard place, but with sand grains tossed into the mix. These idioms didn't just spice up conversation, they reminded Egyptians that beneath the veneer of civilization, the desert loomed, ready to reclaim its dominion. Surprisingly, sand-related terms also appeared in more abstract realms. For instance, the word deshret, referring to the red desert sand, was connoted with danger, barrenness, and the wild unknown, concepts integral to Egyptian cosmology and religion. This was the dust of death and chaos, the outer space beyond the ordered Nile Valley, a constant threat, but also a necessary balance. It was as if their words were dusted with the very particles whose presence shaped endless myths about the struggle between order, ma'at, and chaos, isfet. And then there's the linguistic artistry of wordplay, a favorite pastime for Egyptians. The fact that words sounding like sand could simultaneously hint at time and decay offered fertile ground for puns and poetic riddles. Imagine attending an ancient Egyptian salon where the dusty metaphor drip-fed clever double meanings like grains through an hourglass. Conversations, songs, and inscriptions thrived on this sandy symphony of meanings, revealing a culture deeply aware of the grittiness literally underfoot. But maybe the most delightfully ironic detail is that sand was both a bane and a boon in the very writing itself. Hieroglyphic inscriptions were painstakingly carved into stone or painted on papyrus, the former durable, the latter fragile. Papyrus scrolls made from ancient reeds were vulnerable to being damaged by dust and grit blown in from the desert winds. Scholars have speculated how many ancient texts might have been lost, smudged, or rendered indecipherable because of the sand that stubbornly invaded even the most sacred scribes' workshops. So, in a way, the sand wrote and rewrote Egyptian history, sometimes erasing what was deemed important, sometimes preserving it in unexpected ways. This intimate relationship extended to personal names too, some of which referenced sand or its qualities, embracing the gritty reality of life openly. Names containing the element of deshret sometimes invoked resilience, like sand itself, enduring, slipping, reshaping, enduring again. It's a poetic rebellion. Instead of fighting sand, the Egyptians spoke it into their souls, making it part of their identity. The language and symbols of ancient Egypt ultimately serve as a testament to the stubborn presence of the desert's tiny soldiers. Sand wasn't background noise, it was a character, an influence, a constant reminder that no matter how great the pyramids, how lush the Nile, or how elaborate the temple rituals, life's true texture was granular, scratchy, uncertain, and undeniably gritty. In the end, sand as a roommate didn't just kick up dust, it shaped dreams, fears, poems, and the very alphabet of one of the world's oldest civilizations. It gave voice to the painstaking reality that ancient Egyptian life was lived with gritty determination, an existence literally sandwiched between river and desert, order and chaos, spirit and dust. So next time you feel the annoyance of sand in your shoes, spare a thought for the Egyptians. For them, it was more than grit. It was a word, a metaphor, a reminder carved into stone that life's little grains often tell the biggest stories. Imagine a place where sand is not just beneath your feet, but assaults you from every direction, grinding into your eyes, sneaking under your clothes, filling every crevice in your home. This is no desert wasteland untouched by human life, but rather the home of the ancient Egyptians living on the very edge of the desert. The small oasis towns and isolated desert outposts where sand was both a menace and an unexpected companion. These communities were the unsung specialists of survival, the ones who had to make peace with a world that felt like an eternal sandstorm. While the great temples and bustling cities by the Nile thrived with relative ease, here life was a daily negotiation with the harshness of the desert. You might picture an oasis as a tranquil paradise, palm trees swaying, clear waters shimmering. And yes, some were like that, but they were also tiny, fragile jewels surrounded by an unforgiving sea of grains, each one attacking relentlessly. It was sand on the move, sand that could smother crops overnight or fill a well by morning. The people who called these places home developed a sort of forced intimacy with sand, learning to live with its grit rather than wishing it away. Their houses weren't the solid stone and mud brick palaces of the Nile Valley, but often humble structures made of palm trunks and reeds, bonded with mud, lightweight enough to replace as sand-buried parts over time. Imagine trying to keep your walls standing when each morning feels like a shove from the desert, with sand piling up to swallow your doorway or windowsill. Water, the most precious resource here, dictated how and where people lived. The oasis pools were their lifeline, fed by underground springs or occasional rains that were more a tease than a blessing. Any farmer in these margins lived by one rule: conserve water like a miser with gold. Sophisticated channels and underground irrigation systems, canals, helped guide what little water there was directly into the roots of date palms and the thin, stubborn crops that managed to survive. But growing food wasn't just about water. It was about doing battle with sand, wind, and the scorching sun. Crops had to be hardy. Barley, a staple of the Egyptian diet, was preferred because it could survive more neglect and less water than wheat. Date palms, with their towering canopies, provided crucial shade that reduced evaporation and gave shelter to smaller plants beneath them. In a way, these oases were more than just islands of life. They were microcosms of controlled chaos, where plants, people, and endless sand battled for survival. The inhabitants here had to be resourceful beyond anything in the Nile cities. Sand didn't just invade homes. It clogged wells, wore down tools, and made travel treacherous. Winds would whip up violent sandstorms that could blind travelers and bury entire outposts if left unchecked. Merchants crossing the desert routes relied on expert knowledge handed down for generations, knowing when and where the sand would shift, carrying supplies only when the skies were clear and the winds low. Those caravan routes were like the lifeblood of these remote communities, connecting them to the broader world, but also exposing them to constant danger. Sandstorms weren't just weather phenomena, they were existential threats. You didn't just lose camels or merchandise, you risked losing entire trading relationships, and, with them, essential goods, grain, metal tools, salt. It's hard to overstate how relentlessly annoying sand was. Think about it. Today, most of us complain about a little dirt in the house. For these ancient desert dwellers, sand was a constant mechanical irritant. It ground against leather sandals until they wore thin, stopped the hinges on wooden doors from turning, and settled into every nook of their woven baskets. Even their clothes, simple linen tunics, were subject to the near-constant abrasion of sand particles. Protection from the elements became a necessity. Head coverings were imperative, not just stylish, but essential shields against both sunstroke and the abrasive sandy winds. Tools were often made with both durability and repairability in mind. Losing a chisel or knife to a shower of sand and grit could mean disaster for daily work. And yet sand was also a resource. The fine grains held a kind of magic. Some of the oasis communities became centers for crafting, turning sand into glass long before it became common elsewhere. They learned to harness their environment, melting quartz sand over fire to produce shimmering beads and delicate vessels, no doubt treasured by desert travelers and city dwellers alike. At night, when the fierce desert heat finally ebbed, communities gathered around lamps fueled by date palm oil or animal fat. Stories were exchanged. Laughter rose as sand settled everywhere and nowhere, and the harshness of the day momentarily gave way to human warmth. It was a life that demanded grit, literally and figuratively. Being a desert dweller meant a combative relationship with nature, but also incredible resilience. These small towns at the desert's edge were not mere relics or forgotten outposts, but vital players in the tapestry of ancient Egyptian civilization. They guarded the boundaries, facilitated trade, and pushed the limits of what it meant to exist in a world where sand was not just dirt, but a defining character in their daily drama. In these gritty margins, survival wasn't just about avoiding death. It was about a kind of stubborn persistence, a refusal to yield to the elements, even when the world seemed designed to bury you, grain by grain. And maybe, just maybe, that tenacity shaped a different kind of Egyptian identity, one molded by dust and perseverance as much as by the bedrock of the Nile. Imagine a landscape where two stubborn forces are locked in a ceaseless tug of war. The life-giving rush of the Nile's waters against the relentless creep of harsh, scorching desert sands. This was ancient Egypt's eternal struggle, an ecological dance choreographed by water and grit, where survival wasn't just about mastering the environment, but learning to live with its quirks, annoyances, and outright hostility. Picture the Nile as a titanic artery slicing through an ocean of sand, a shimmering ribbon of promise in a land otherwise defined by dryness so complete it could parch a camel's tongue. The Nile wasn't just a river, it was the river. Its annual flood was the planet's original agricultural miracle, transforming barren banks into lush, fertile, crescent-shaped fields. But here's where it gets interesting. This blessing came with a catch, a no-nonsense reminder that life in Egypt wasn't ever going to be easy or comfortable. The floodwaters brought nutrient-rich silt, but they also coaxed sand to come crashing back in invisible waves, sneaking in from the surrounding deserts. No matter how much the Nile gave, the desert took back twice as much. With every ebb and flow, the river carved fertile patches, only for the wind to assault them relentlessly with fine grains of sand. Farmers learned fast that cultivating crops here was not just about patience, it was a game of constant vigilance against the elements, like having a roommate who never cleaned up and kept throwing sand halfway through the living room. This gritty reality shaped the very way Egyptians viewed the world. Their gods were not merely abstract forces. They personified these environmental extremes. Hapi, the god of the Nile flood, was worshipped as the provider of life and fertility. Yet the desert gods, like Seth, embodied destruction and chaos. Together, they symbolized the fragile balance Egypt had to maintain between irrigation canals that fed life and deserts that swallowed it whole. You might think that with such a stark environment, the Egyptians would have been resigned to a monochrome, bleak existence. Far from it. Their culture thrived precisely because they revered and wrestled with this juxtaposition. The grain stores and granaries that loaded the economy were direct fruits of this delicate equilibrium. The Nile nourished countless fields, yielding barley and emmer wheat, the staples behind bread and beer, the ancient equivalent of pizza and beer nights. But every grain harvested was a tiny victory over relentless sand, drifting like a slow poison smothering the very roots that fed their civilization. Here's a rather humbling fact. Even the ancient Egyptians, masters of elaborate irrigation and water control, couldn't stop the sand entirely. They built canals and dikes, yes, but sand dunes marched like armies reclaiming their territory. Stepping outside a temple or palace was stepping into a world where sand was everywhere, in houses, clothes, grain stores, and even teeth. The ancient equivalent of gritty dust in your snacks or sand in your morning coffee was a daily nuisance, but one they accepted with stoic pragmatism. More than just a physical challenge, this interplay shaped economics and politics. Control of water meant control of life, and by extension, power. Pharaohs invested enormous resources maintaining canals and reservoirs that could nurture crops amid encroaching desert. Tax collection in grain was not merely a financial act, it was a way of asserting authority over nature itself. The sand might try to encroach, but so would the bureaucracy, carefully balancing survival and submission. Ecologically, this symbiosis between river and sand also dictated settlement patterns. Towns, often sprawling along narrow strips beside the Nile, had immense pressure to consolidate life near the few green patches the river blessed. Push too far into the desert, and you'd be buried under unexpected dunes or trapped by lethal heat. Push too close to the water without respect for its seasonal caprices, and your crops drowned or withered. This forced a peculiar kind of urban architecture. Flat roofs, perfect for shaking loose the constant drifts of sand. Mud bricks, designed to trap heat during days, but retain cool at nights. The building blocks of resilience. The sand affected even social rituals and daily life. Imagine waking up to glittering grains everywhere, like the world's most relentless glitter bomb. Every morning, Egyptians had to dust off the layers of gritty reminders that they lived in a desert, forced to adapt everything, even their idols and sacred places, to the persistent presence of fine sand. It wasn't just dirt, it was a physical symbol of life's fragility, a testimony to how the environment was never a passive backdrop, but an active, often unforgiving roommate. And what about the animals? Camels might be poster creatures of desert survival today, but in ancient Egypt, it was the humble donkey and ox that bore the brunt, hauling water and goods while dodging the dry, fierce winds. The desert's harshness sculpted both beast and human, embedding survival strategies into the very DNA of everyday existence. In this continuing saga between the Nile's fluid generosity and desert's gritty persistence, Egyptian life retained a remarkable vibrancy. The river was health, the sand was hazard. The one allowed civilization to flourish, the other kept it humble, sharp, and alert. It was a relationship marked not by detente, but by constant negotiation, like two roommates sharing a tiny apartment where one fills it with clean water and fruit, and the other just insists on throwing handfuls of sand on the floor every chance they get. This duality also explains why ancient Egypt remains such a compelling symbol of resilience and adaptation. The sand wasn't just a nuisance to be brushed off. It was woven into the tapestry of everyday life, a gritty reminder that when you live on the fringe of a desert, survival is never a sure thing. It shapes your agriculture, your beliefs, your politics, and your very way of seeing the world. So next time you picture ancient Egypt, don't just see the golden pyramids gleaming in the sun. Think of the gritty realities lurking just outside the frame. The tiny grains of sand slipping through the cracks, the invisible currents of the Nile pulling life forward, and the relentless negotiation between water and desert that defined every breath, every harvest, every quiet moment of this extraordinary civilization. Because without this ongoing push and pull, there simply would be no Egypt, and certainly no legendary history shaped by sand as much as by stone. If you ever thought childhood was a cushy, sandbox-free era of innocence, think again. Because in ancient Egypt, sand wasn't just a backdrop. It was a relentless, gritty companion, shaping every tiny crumb's first steps into the world. Imagine being a kid in a place where every playground was a shifting expanse of particles sharp enough to scratch, but fine enough to seep everywhere, turning laughter and games into a sandy ordeal. The desert was the ultimate abrasive roommate, not the kind who leaves dirty dishes in the sink, but the kind who sneaks into your bed, your food, your hair, and your eyes. For the youngest Egyptians, sand wasn't just something you dodged, it was woven into the very fabric of daily existence, influencing how they played, learned, and even stayed alive. Picture a Nile-side village buzzing with families, children darting around in linen skirts, their feet kicking up clouds of dust, hands digging into the sandy soil to build rudimentary toys or mock mini mudbricks. Unlike playgrounds padded with rubber or swaddled in grass, these open spaces were a gritty gauntlet of nature. Tiny hands dug into coarse grains, while the ever-present dry breeze ensured you'd never truly escape that fine layer of dust coating everything like a persistent souvenir. Playing wasn't about fancy plastic toys or shiny gadgets. Nope, a stick was a sword, and a clump of hardened mud could transform into a fortress. But that sand, it was the wild card. It got everywhere. Under fingernails, in ears, in eyes, and even tangled in the wisps of hair, probably the original reason for those elaborate Egyptian headpieces. Think of it as a constant background hiss, reminding every child that comfort was a luxury. It was a test of endurance and an unwitting sandbox physics experiment. Education, too, bore the gritty signatures of the environment. Learning wasn't like plopping down with a tablet or a book. The Egyptian tutors and scribes cleverly adapted by using wooden writing boards coated with a thin layer of plaster, or more famously, papyrus scrolls. But early schooling often began with practice on clay tablets, or even in the sand itself, where stick and finger strokes carved hieroglyphs, that might be wiped away by a careless gust. Can you imagine trying to master the intricate symbols of a language when the ground beneath you feels like it's constantly trying to erase your progress? Beyond the intellectual sandbox stood the physical challenge. The abrasive environment wasn't just inconvenient, it was hazardous. Children were vulnerable to respiratory issues, eye infections, and the harsher abrasions caused by the ever-present grit. Sandstorms could whip through villages like a natural furnace, pelting exposed skin and turning playtime into a sneezing, squinting mess. Parents armed their kids with remedies, ointments made from ointments extracted from rare herbs or animal fats, but these were more palliatives than cures, a buffer between innocence and the raw realities of desert life. One particularly grim detail: the sand's contribution to dental problems. Kids gnawed on bread that, thanks to the grinding stones dusted with sand particles, contained fine, tooth-wearing grit. This resulted in worn, cracked teeth over time, making mealtime less of a joy and more of a chore. So much for childhood sweet treats. The rough diet was like chewing through tiny shards of glass, a gritty testament to the fact that even food wasn't free from the desert's grasp. Yet, there was resilience. Egyptian children learned to navigate this harsh landscape with a mix of adoption and ingenuity. Parents handed down traditions of clothing to shield the skin, light, loose linens that flapped in the wind to shoo away dust, and wide-brimmed hats fashioned to fend off sun and sand. Kids learned to play close to the Nile, where the sandy grit was less oppressive, and sometimes even dipped their toes in the river's cool embrace, momentarily sanitized from the desert's endless particles. The sand also informed social play and rites of passage. Children sometimes created small clay figurines or miniature models out of mud and sand mixtures, honing skills that would prove useful for artisanship later in life. These playthings were unlike the expensive plastic toys we take for granted, but carried significant cultural weight. They were tools of imagination, practice, and connection. Embedded in these humble artifacts was a gritty reminder: even amidst hardship, creativity blossomed. Interestingly, the ancient Egyptian approach to childhood sharpened certain senses and skills. The need to keep sand from eyes and mouths may have fostered early awareness and self-care habits. Scrapes and cuts, frequent as they were, offered lessons in survival and hygiene, far removed from the sanitized bubble many children today know. It was a brutal, unvarnished education, not just in letters or numbers, but in resilience, adaptability, and endurance. And let's not forget the tough love of Egyptian health advice. If a kid showed signs of respiratory distress or eye infections, which were as common as the Nile mud itself, remedies mixed with crushed malachite, animal fats, or resin were applied, often under the watchful eyes of family healers or midwives. It wasn't pretty, but it often worked well enough to keep children alive in a hostile world that respected toughness and practicality over pampering. In that unforgiving terrain, childhood was a dance between innocence and grit, quite literally. The environment was neither guest nor nuisance. It was an omnipresent character in the drama of growing up in ancient Egypt. Whether lying in bed, the fine whispering grains would slip through windows and robes alike. Whether bustling through crowds or sitting quietly at a scribe's side, sand was an ever-present co-star, shaping experience and memory alike. So next time you watch a kid struggle with grains in their sneakers or gripe about a dusty playground, spare a thought for those ancient Egyptian tots. They didn't just live with sand, they formed a bizarre partnership with it, one built on stubborn resilience, constant adjustment, and an unexpectedly gritty sense of humor born from a life where every day really was a sandstorm of challenges. Because in ancient Egypt, sand wasn't just underfoot, it was woven into the very story of childhood itself. If you think ancient Egyptian art is all about polished stone, smooth lines, and golden radiance, think again. Sand had its own starring role, leaving a gritty fingerprint on every surface, every carving, every brush stroke that survived thousands of years. The ancient Egyptians didn't just live in proximity to deserts. They lived immersed in the textures, colors, and omnipresent presence of sand. And their art, it tells us that sand wasn't just background noise. It was a vital part of their world, captured in ways that are subtle, surprising, and downright tactile. Step into any tomb, temple, or palace wall, and you'll start to see sand not just as a passive setting, but as an active player in the visual story. Take those wall paintings, for example. At first glance, they might look like flawless depictions of gods, pharaohs, and daily life. But examine closely, and you'll notice the fine graininess of pigment blends, the way artists used tiny dots and stipples to mimic dust settling on surfaces, or the shimmer of baked, arid earth under a relentless sun. It's almost as if you can feel the sand seeping through your fingertips, reminding you that these scenes were crafted in a place where sand was less an annoyance and more an intimate companion. Consider the well-known tombs of the Valley of the Kings, where every painted surface seems almost too perfect to be real, until you realize the ancient artists weren't trying to smooth things over for us modern viewers. Instead, they let the world's rough edges bleed through. The surfaces bear the faint abrasion marks from sandstorms that have swept across them over millennia. These tiny scars mirror the constant presence of gritty particles that workers hauled in with their own feet, literally rubbing the desert into the very bones of the art. The walls might glow with the yellow of lapis lazuli or the deep red of ochre, but the sand survives just below the surface, like a secret ingredient stubbornly refusing to be washed away. And then there are the carvings. Oh, the carvings. Far from just clean lines etched into stone, many reliefs carry a surprisingly tactile coarseness. It's as if the chisels carried the texture of sand along with them, their staccato swipes made over stone that itself was shaped and weathered by millennia of wind-blown grit. Some of the more weathered sculptures in open courtyards look less like smooth alabaster and more like stone that has been sandblasted by Mother Nature. Each chip and scrape an accidental homage to the desert's relentless hand. Those tiny imperfections don't detract, they enrich the narrative, weaving the desert's personality right into the figures of gods, kings, and everyday folk. Sculptures, too, tell a similar tale. The iconic statues of pharaohs, with their stoic expressions and unyielding gazes, seem paradoxically softened by the subtle graininess left by the natural environment. The faces might be immaculately carved, sharp cheekbones, symmetrical eyes, but the stone's surface often reveals a speckled texture, faintly recalling the desert sands that covered the lands beyond the Nile's banks. Evidence suggests many statues were originally painted, and beneath those layers, color probably mingled with fine desert dust, creating a surface that captured light in a complex dance of smooth form and granular texture. Here's where it gets really fascinating. Some artists deliberately chose to incorporate sand into their pigments and plaster, not out of laziness or a shortage of materials, but because the gritty texture added a level of realism and tactile authenticity. Imagine mixing fine desert sand into the paint itself, like mixing sand into your morning smoothie, only less appetizing, obviously. The resulting surfaces had a matte, tactile finish that echoed the world outside the tomb's protective walls, reminding anyone who gazed upon them that life wasn't polished, it was gritty. This technique brought a three-dimensional sense to flat planes of paint, evoking the rough surfaces of mud brick and stone, the cracked earth under the sun, or the blend of sand and water that formed the banks of the Nile. Even stylized representations of natural elements in Egyptian art betray a keen awareness of sand's omnipresence. Palm trees and papyrus plants are painted not just as idealized symbols, but with hints of dust motes and grainy textures on the leaves and stalks, deliberate touches that convey the harshness of their environment. The desert was not a distant backdrop, but a living, breathing entity, an adversary, a provider, and a spiritual force. The art acknowledges this duality by faithfully embedding sand's physicality into its very structure. If you look closely at scenes of everyday life, farmers sowing seeds, fishermen hulling nets, craftsmen sculpting arrows, you can almost feel the crunch beneath their sandals. Artists conveyed this by accentuating the roughness of the surfaces underfoot with scratchy cross-hatching and granulated shading techniques, bringing to mind the texture of coarse grains that slip inexorably through human grasp. Even the way shadows are painted sometimes hints at the fine, gritty particles floating in shafts of sunlight. A subtle nod to the dusty reality that Egyptians experienced daily. And don't forget the sacred texts inscribed in temple corridors. Hieroglyphs themselves, those elegant symbols we often think of as perfectly clean and mathematical, have a secret grit to them. Carvings sometimes show minute pitting and roughening, where the stone's surface was sanded down just enough to create texture that was both visible and tactile. It's a surprising reminder that these symbols weren't conjured from a sterile workshop, but hammered out in an environment where sand was a constant, unavoidable presence. When you think about it, the ancient Egyptian relationship with sand is a bit like living with a roommate who never cleans up after themselves and keeps throwing glitter everywhere. Only the glitter is dirt, dust, and tiny grains that infiltrated every corner of life. Artists, knowingly or not, preserved this irrepressible omnipresence in their work, balancing idealization with raw, earthy texture. Sand as a physical reality shaped how art looked. Sand as a metaphor shaped how Egyptians understood their place in the world. The infinite desert was a source of danger and dread, mystery and awe, a reminder of the impermanence of stone monuments and the fragility of life itself. By embedding the roughness, coarseness, and visual signature of sand into their creations, Egyptian artists invited viewers to experience not just the images, but the very environment that cradled their civilization. So, next time you gaze at perfectly preserved Egyptian art in a museum or book, imagine the layers beneath. Not just paint or carved stone, but the fine grit of sand grains embedded in the very texture of the work. The sand, ancient and persistent, is still there. It's not just a backdrop or a nuisance. It's a silent roommate, ever present, whispering the gritty truth of Egyptian life across millennia. Step outside in modern Egypt, and you're immediately reminded that sand isn't some distant relic locked away in dusty textbooks or ancient tombs. No, sand is the country's eternal roommate, the uninvited guest who never really leaves, no matter how much you might want carpet or hardwood floors instead. It's literally everywhere, wrapping around daily life like an invisible, grainy cloak. But it's not just a nuisance. Sand is woven tightly into Egypt's identity, its challenges, its resilience, and even its creativity. Look at Cairo, a sprawling metropolis pressing hard against the edge of the desert. The city's skyline is punctuated by gleaming glass towers, ancient minarets, and all the trappings of a vibrant, modern capital. Yet even here, sand is an omnipresent force. The dusty haze that frequently blankets the city, turning the horizon a murky yellow-brown, is a constant reminder that the desert isn't just at the city's edge, It's in its lungs. It seeps into everything: cars, homes, toaster ovens, your coffee cup. Ever try to keep sand out of your sneakers after a stroll near the pyramids? Good luck with that. But sand is more than just a dusty inconvenience. It is the building block, quite literally, of the historic and modern architecture that defines Egypt. The same desert particles that once shadowed pyramid builders now underpin skyscrapers and roads. Concrete, when you break it down, owes much of its bulk to crushed rock and sand. Egypt's vast supply of high-quality silica sand feeds the massive construction industry, from the preserved monuments of Giza to the bridges and dams of the 21st century. Sand shapes Egypt's physical space at every level, solid and sandy at once. And then there's the cultural aspect. Sand dunes aren't just the backdrop for Instagram selfies in the Sahara. They're the stage for a desert dance as old as history itself. Every tourist meanders across those dunes, echoing the footsteps of ancient travelers, traders, and nomads. Local Bedouin communities still navigate this granular wilderness with intimate knowledge passed down through generations, knowledge that helped civilizations thrive in what many would simply call an endless expanse of hostile, blistering nothingness. Yet, this omnipresent sand comes with relentless challenges. Sandstorms, those chaotic tempests of airborne grit, don't just blow sand around, they disrupt lives. Cities must don a kind of armor. Buildings are designed to withstand sand damage. Residents clad themselves with scarves and masks just to venture outside. Airports and highways temporarily shut down. Solar panels must be cleaned constantly, lest they lose efficiency under a gritty coat. Sand refuses to be tamed completely. It encroaches upon arable land, turning fertile fields into drifting deserts. Egypt's famous Nile Delta, the breadbasket of the nation, is under subtle siege from drifting sands, a slow but steady threat to food security. And beneath Egypt's cities, sand is quietly shifting, sometimes causing infrastructure headaches. Subterranean sand movement can undermine foundations, settling unpredictably and leading to costly repairs and urban maintenance nightmares. The very ground beneath Egyptians' feet is restless, a reminder that sand does not simply rest quietly. It is dynamic, insistent. But if sand is such a formidable foe, how is it that Egypt thrives? The answer lies in adaptation and a stubborn, almost poetic coexistence. Egyptians have learned to live with their sandy roommate in ways both practical and charming. Rooftops are often nothing more than flat terraces, perfect for blowing off excess sand and catching the breeze, or holding a rooftop gathering under a sprawling sky dusted faintly with sand particles. Traditional architecture favors thick walls that withstand sandstorms and retain coolness. Streets are designed with wind corridors in mind. Everyday objects even reflect this reality. The ubiquitous use of straw mats inside homes isn't just decoration, It's a practical buffering against the endless flow of fine desert dust. Sand also inspires Egyptian art, literature, and folklore. It's the immortal grain in stories of desert spirits, nomadic caravans, and the ever-present sun that bakes the dunes to glassy hardness by day and lets them freeze by night. Sand is the raw material of myth as much as it is of mortar. In tourism, sand is both the prize and the puzzle. Millions flock to see the ancient monuments carved from stone formed under ancient seas of sand and sediment. Tour operators offer rides across the dunes on camels or quad bikes, juxtaposing timelessness with adrenaline. At the same time, authorities wrestle with the environmental impact of mass tourism on fragile desert ecosystems, where a footprint can last centuries, and a careless disturbance can derail a delicate balance. Even Egypt's ambitious mega projects, like the new administrative capital, shifting the nucleus of government eastward, confront the kingdom's gritty destiny. Engineers must constantly battle shifting sands, designing underground structures that won't collapse under sand pressure, developing techniques to stabilize the terrain. Sand is a silent, granular opponent to even the most high-tech plans. This enduring dialogue with sand is a testament to Egypt's profound relationship with its environment, a landscape shaped by desert and river alike. Sand is not just a passive background character in the story of Egypt. It is often the protagonist, the antagonist, and everything in between. It commands respect, demands ingenuity, and subtly reminds Egyptians and visitors alike of the country's ancient roots and unbroken connection to the arid world around them. So next time you find yourself dusting grains from your shoes after a day wandering Egyptian streets, or marveling at the silhouette of distant dunes at sunset, remember this: sand is more than irritating grit. It's the whisper of time, carrying ancient stories in every speck, and a gritty reminder that some roommates never truly move out. Imagine the relentless, omnipresent sand seeping into every crack, every crevice, every nook and cranny of ancient Egyptian life, not just as ground beneath their sandals, but as an ever-watchful, grainy character in their stories, myths, and folklore. Sand wasn't just the backdrop to daily drudgery. It was a symbolic actor, a storyteller's prop, and sometimes the villain or the savior in the narratives woven along the Nile. The ancient Egyptians didn't just live with sand, they lived through it, and their tales capture that gritty relationship in strikingly vivid ways. Now, it might sound a bit odd to imagine a bunch of desert dwellers chatting around campfires about sand, the way we might banter about weather or traffic. But the sand was more than just dust in their eyes or an itchy nuisance. It represented chaos, the unknown, and even divine power. Egyptian mythology famously balanced order and chaos, with the orderly, life-giving Nile on one side and the chaotic desert on the other, almost like a high-maintenance roommate who insisted on throwing sand in your eye every morning. That desert sand was often personified in their stories, something wild and untamed, a symbol of everything outside the neat and tidy boundaries of civilization. Take the god Set, for instance. Set is often portrayed as the god of deserts, storms, disorder, and violence, a cosmic embodiment of chaos lurking in the shifting dunes. He wasn't just a mythic figure, he was the embodiment of sand's darker side. Stories recount Set as a god who stirred up sandstorms, conjuring unpredictable whirlwinds that could blind travelers or bury villages. Imagine ancient folk tales serving as a stylized version of Mother Nature's hysterical mood swings, with a pinch of bad luck thrown in. Set's chaotic sandstorms were metaphors for the dangers lying just beyond the fertile banks, a vivid reminder that while the desert might look picturesque, it was unforgiving and deadly. But sand wasn't just chaos incarnate, it was also loaded with creative symbolism. Think about the myth of the 7 scorpions sent to protect the goddess Isis while she fled with the baby Horus. These scorpions were said to come out of the desert sands, embodying both danger and protection. They were a living question mark, a reminder that the sand might hide lethal threats, yet also powerful guardians. Sand grittily insists on respect, demanding both awe and caution with every grain. The very notion of writing on sand surfaces appears in the Egyptian mind as deeply symbolic. Ancient Egyptian tales describe scribes who, unable to inscribe eternal records on the shifting sands, turned instead to papyrus to create lasting narratives. The futility of writing in sand, knowing the desert wind would soon erase it, became a metaphor in itself. Transient knowledge, fragile memory, human efforts against nature's relentless erasure. It was as if the sand mocked humanity's hubris, a cosmic good luck sealing that in sand, buddy. This interplay between permanence and impermanence is a recurring mood in Egyptian folklore, embedded in their reflections on mortality, memory, and the afterlife. Even the famed Book of the Dead hints at the desert's gritty omnipresence, though indirectly. Many spells and prayers implore protection against dangers lurking beyond the safe, water-bordered lands, precisely where the desert, with all its sandstorms and serpents, reigned supreme. The afterlife journey wasn't just about crossing waterways or cosmological skies. It was also confrontations with harsh sands, barren landscapes where the soul might flounder if unprepared. Sand, in these stories, symbolizes the boundary between life and death, chaos and order, forgetting and eternally remembering. Then there are the more playful human tales about sand's irritating omnipresence. Imagine an ancient Egyptian favorite anecdote, perhaps a poor laborer, mid-work on the pyramids, exasperated by sand creeping into his linen tunic, into his food, into his very soul, muttering to himself about sand as the universe's most spiteful roommate. Of course, ancient Egyptians didn't have Twitter for these complaints, but their humor crept in through folk rhymes, graffiti sprinkled on workers' huts, and colorful tales told in dim-lit taverns by the Nile. These stories humanize the gritty mess that was desert life, the tiny grains that, while insignificant alone, amassed into a constant melee of annoyance, like 1,000 invisible itches. Among the more poetic reflections is the myth of the sun god Ra's daily journey through the underworld, beneath the desert by day, a realm where sandstorms rage and the fierce desert beasts lurk. Ra's nightly voyage along this shadowy, sand-filled domain was a cosmic metaphor for renewal and endurance. Sand here represents the perilous trial all life must pass through, a gritty crucible of transformation, just out of sight, beneath blazing golden horizons. Sand was even woven into etiquette and sacred expectations, tales warning against venturing barefoot into the desert underscore not just the physical discomfort, but the symbolic disrespect towards the powers manifest in the sand's shifting landscapes. It was an invisible, abrasive force keeping humanity humble. Respect the sand, respect the desert, respect the boundary between order and chaos. Folklore didn't shy away from blending mortal frustration with divine reverence. Stories whispered about desert winds, carrying the voices of ancient ancestors, the grains beneath one's feet being bits of cosmic dust infused with sacred memory. Sand was dust, yes, but also a cosmic ingredient, ancient, eternal, and unyielding. It was a stubborn roommate, an eternal companion, sometimes friend, sometimes foe. So when you picture ancient Egyptians telling tales by firelight or under the scorching sun, don't think of them just narrating gods and kings. Imagine them scratching fingers in sand, tracing figures in stories, feeling the itch and grit slip insidiously between words. Sand was there, always, whether as a chaotic god, protective spirit, or annoying nuisance. Sand was a character they couldn't ignore. The desert's silent voice cracked through their stories, shaping how they understood their world and their place within it. In the end, sand was more than just a backdrop to history. It was a narrative force, a persistent grain leaving traces on the minds, myths, and memories of a civilization that literally built an empire out of its dusty embrace. And as anyone who's ever felt sand stuck between their toes could tell you, there's something strangely poetic about hating and honoring the same gritty companion. The ancient Egyptians knew this well. Sand wasn't just their roommate, it was their muse, their menace, their eternal, crunchy cohabitant in the great story of human survival. Imagine sand as more than just a pesky irritant, sticking to your clothes or sneaking into your breakfast cereal. For the ancient Egyptians, sand was not just dirt beneath their feet, it was a constant, unyielding presence, an omnipresent roommate who shaped their entire existence. And like any stubborn housemate, sand didn't politely knock before barging into every nook and cranny of their lives. It was gritty, relentless, and impossible to ignore. But over thousands of years, rather than curse this unwelcome roommate, the people of ancient Egypt learned to coexist with sand. They became masters of turning what seemed like an obstacle into a key ingredient of their civilization's success story. The vast deserts surrounding the Nile were not merely empty wastelands, but fertile stages for cultural innovation and spiritual depth, all baked, quite literally, under the glare of an unforgiving sun and buried beneath endless dunes. On a physical level, sand shaped Egypt's geography and architecture from the ground up. Take the iconic pyramids, giants of stone, rising from the desert like geometric monuments to human tenacity. Those colossal tombs would not have been possible without the desert sands that defined the landscape, providing both a challenge and a canvas. Building in and with sand forced the Egyptians to develop ingenious engineering techniques. Foundations had to be stable, materials resilient, and plans meticulously executed, lest their monuments sink or collapse, like poorly constructed sandcastles at high tide. But the relationship wasn't merely practical. There was a deep, almost spiritual dimension to their ongoing wrestling match with the granular desert. Sand was woven into their mythology and worldview. The desert was not just a place, but a symbol of chaos and desolation, yes, but also of purity and eternal transformation. The god Set, often associated with the desert's harshness, embodied chaos and disorder, threatening the cosmic balance. Yet, paradoxically, that same wilderness was also a gateway to renewal. The endless shifting sands mirrored life itself, constantly changing, eroding old forms, forging new ones. In their religious rituals, deserts and sand held a tacit sacredness. The smooth, shimmering grains that could scratch like sandpaper also represented infinity and the divine. Funerary texts and tomb decorations often depicted journeys through desert landscapes, emphasizing the idea of crossing boundaries between life and death, order and chaos, mortal and divine. To live alongside sand meant embracing impermanence and endurance simultaneously. Culturally, the omnipresence of sand also influenced daily life's texture, the very texture of being Egyptian. Their clothing, their crafts, even their entertainment bore traces of this gritty solution to the problem of desert living. Sandstorms could turn a bustling market into a blinding whirlwind of blinding dust, forcing people to adapt quickly or suffer the consequences. The simple act of maintaining cleanliness, inside and out, became a ritual of vigilance and resilience. It's hard to imagine how an ancient Egyptian might have felt wiping sand from eyes, ears, and nostrils day in and day out, but they endured day after relentless day. This gritty persistence echoes today in the modern courage to face every challenge the environment throws at us. The sand wasn't just a physical presence, it was a teacher, one whose lessons demand respect. Resilience, for instance. Imagine thriving for millennia in an environment that sees you as little more than a grain of dust on a vast, uncaring stage. It's not just about survival, but about flourishing despite unyielding odds. The ancient Egyptians demonstrated that resilience isn't just about brute strength, but about ingenuity, adaptation, and acceptance. They carved civilizations out of sand, just as they did stones, proving that even the most inhospitable surroundings could nurture astonishing achievement. Adaptation was another crucial lesson. When resources are scarce, when the ground is unstable and the climate punishingly dry, creative problem-solving isn't just an asset, it's a necessity. The way the Egyptians harnessed the cyclical flooding of the Nile, a watery ribbon slicing through relentless expanses of sand to cultivate their crops, exemplifies this brilliance. They did not fight nature's rhythms, they embraced them. The sand encouraged a mindset of harmony with the environment, not domination over it. So, what can we, modern dwellers with air conditioning and cars, learn from an ancient society eternally dusted by desert storms? Perhaps the most profound takeaway is the notion of coexistence, not forcing nature to bend entirely to our will, but working alongside it, understanding its limits and strengths. The Egyptians teach us that even the harshest, grittiest realities can be reframed as opportunities for growth and creativity rather than mere obstacles. In a way, the sand's omnipresence reminds us that life itself is fundamentally imperfect, full of irritations, disruptions, and unpredictability. Maybe that's why their civilization celebrated cycles of death and rebirth, chaos and order. The grains of sand slipping through one's fingers could represent moments lost, struggles faced, or chance encounters. But together, those grains build vast deserts, endless horizons stretching beyond sight, and histories layered thick like sediment in the earth. The desert sands didn't merely irritate or impede, they shaped identity. They etched into every facet of Egyptian culture a gritty resilience, a humility before the forces of nature, and a fierce determination to craft meaning and beauty amid hardship. As the winds carry these grains across time, they remind us of a poignant truth. We are all, in one way or another, living alongside our own metaphoric deserts. Our challenges, be they environmental, personal, or societal, beckon us to find harmony with what we cannot control. So, next time you feel life's grit gnawing at your patience, be it sand in your shoes or metaphorical sand in the gears, remember the ancient Egyptians and their eternal dance with the desert. They teach us to endure, to adapt, and most importantly, to find not just survival, but grace and purpose in even the grittiest of circumstances. Sand as a roommate may not be ideal, but with the right attitude, it could just be the world's oldest, most persistent teacher.